Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod, and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello, and welcome to episode 90. We're creeping up on the 100th episode. It's half term, which is, every time it comes around, I think it's just as much for me as for the children. And although it's very nice having my days free to do with them as I wish, I really, really like not having to do the school run. And I think, I don't know, it's day one, so I could be, they seem to be okay so far. Day one, it's okay. But I keep thinking about Nicola Bully's kids. They're having half term without their mum. The saga goes on. There's not a lot to add to that, but I'm just hoping a resolution is found soon. Now, today we're going back on the London Tube, and I really have a story for you today that is one of the reasons I wanted to take you on the London Tubes in the first place, I have to say, because it's real classic, old school London history, which I just love. And we are going to the tube station of Bank, one of the most confusing stops on the London Tube. To talk about, but also to research, because when doing online searches, you find a lot of info on local bank branches or on the place which the tube was named after, the Bank of England. So, it's hampered me somewhat. But for those not in the know, there is in fact a tube station called Bank. It opened in 1900, initially served by the Central, Northern and Waterloo and City lines, and was linked to the Docklands Light Railway Station monument in 1933, and is one of the deepest tube stations in London. For those who don't know, the Docklands Light Railway is a sort of weird little train that goes out to Docklands. And it's great. If you go at the front, it's electric. If you go at the front, you can feel like you're driving the train. And I can't remember what stop it is, but there's one stop quite near the end of the DLR, which has an incredible Chinese restaurant, and you can go and eat amazing dim sum and watch the planes take off and land at City Airport. For those of you who are into that sort of thing, highly recommend it. If the name of the restaurant comes to me, I will just shout it out halfway through the podcast. Monument, while we're at it, is named after the Monument to the Great Fire of London, situated to the northern end of London Bridge near to Pudding Lane, where the fire started. And I didn't really know this until more recently than I should do, that it was, it's one of those things that you just take for granted. Monument, didn't really think about what it was a monument to. It's a Doric column built in Portland stone, and it's topped with a gilded urn of fire designed by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke, and its height marks its distance from the site of the shop of Thomas Fariner, the King's baker, where the blaze began. There's a viewing platform near the top, which you can get to via a narrow winding staircase of 345 steps. So if you see it and you fancy it, you can just walk to the top. But a mesh cage was added in the mid-19th century to prevent people jumping off. After 6 people died by suicide there between 1788 and 1842. A little bit of history for you there. Bank, like many of the London tube stations, is believed to be haunted. In fact, some say it's the most haunted in the city. People experience a feeling of dread and foreboding, and sometimes a putrid smell, believed to be linked to the plague pits under neighbouring Liverpool Street Station. I'm always really impressed when you say that people feel a sense of dread and foreboding, because when I've travelled the tube during one of my many bouts of anxiety, I feel dread and foreboding about being on a small, fast train in a tiny tunnel underground. So to specify it at a particular stop seems unusual to me. The most famous haunting is linked to the Bank of England. It goes back to the early 19th century when a young clerk, Paul Whitehead, worked at the bank. Now, unfortunately, Whitehead fell in with a bad crowd. He was fired. They don't really specify what for, but he went into forging checks, so whether he was fired for something similar. And then he was caught and sentenced to be executed in November 1811. But something more tragic would result from his death, the madness of his devoted younger sister, Sarah, who would go to the bank every day asking for him. And she did so for the rest of her life. Now, she was supported by the bank staff who knew her and knew what was going on. But eventually she started to accuse those higher up of cheating her of her fortune. There's actually paperwork relating to a court case about this where she, I think, takes them to court accusing them of this. And she sort of becomes quite an aggressive figure. Now, when she died, a ghost started appearing in the bank and in the bank's garden, and many believed it must be Sarah looking for her brother. And the spectre became known as the Black Nun because of her nun-like headdress. But it's not the haunted tube station we're here to talk about. No. In the 19th century, the Russian pogroms led to many Jews emigrating, and between 1875 and 1914, around 120,000 arrived in the UK, settling in the East End of London. A 1900 study identified both Houndsditch and Whitechapel as well-defined intensely Jewish districts. Some of these expatriates were revolutionaries, and gang warfare raged between opposing factions. And when you read about these areas in this time, it becomes really clear that it's just sort of considered a land of foreigners. It's the city of London. It's not very central. It's not the centre of London. And it's this sort of area of foreigners, essentially, at the time. Now, this led to concerns among Londoners and the press. Nothing changes. With an article in the Times describing the Whitechapel area as one that, quote, harbours some of the worst alien anarchists and criminals who seek our too hospitable shore, and these are the men who use the pistol and the knife. In 1905, the government passed the Aliens Act to reduce immigration, giving power to popular xenophobic feeling, which was again encouraged in the press. An article in the Manchester Evening Chronicle described, quote, the dirty, destitute, diseased, verminous and criminal foreigner who dumps himself on our soil. And I've written, not much changes. Amongst all this anti-immigrant feeling, a small group of Latvian revolutionaries, led by anarchist George Gardstein, would meet at the Anarchist Club on Jubilee Street in Stepney. Before his arrival in London, Gardstein had been accused of murder and acts of terrorism in Warsaw. Another member of the group was Jacob Peters, who had been an agitator in the Russian army and had served time in prison where he had undergone torture, resulting in the removal of his fingernails. He would go on to serve in the government on his return to Russia in 1917. Peter's cousin Fritz Svars, a Latvian, who had been arrested by the Russian authorities 3 times for terrorist offences but escaped each time, was also in the gang. He's going to be very pivotal to our story. Now, he had travelled through the United States, where he undertook a series of robberies before arriving in London in June 1910. Though by the time of our story, the Metropolitan Police were in existence and responsible for policing most of the capital, the City of London Police were responsible for law enforcement within historic city boundaries. Both were issued with short wooden truncheons for their day-to-day duties, and when facing armed adversaries, they were given Webley and Bulldog revolvers, shotguns, and small-bore rifles. The 2 events that we're going to talk about today, one causes the next, but it's actually the second event that gets remembered and has gone down in history, but it wouldn't have taken place without the first, so I really wanted to cover both in today's. And the first is in Houndsditch, which is a road and area in the City of London in December 1910. And so this was dealt with by the City of London Police, and the subsequent actions at Sidney Street in January 1911 were in the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Force. So, as we see in a lot of cases, there needs to be communication between next door police forces. The politician overseeing both services was the 36-year-old ambitious Home Secretary, Winston Churchill. You may have heard of him. So here we are in December 1910 in the City of London, in a busy commercial area with buildings holding living and working spaces for dealers and manufacturers. Many of those living there were families from Eastern Europe. The majority are hardworking and honest, but amongst them moved those with a more sinister intention, including Gardstein's gang. Now, Gardstein was described as handsome and well-dressed, and he is lodging at 44 Gold Street with the Kempler family, who believed him to be a chemistry student. He said that he was studying chemistry and everything he was doing was funded by a very wealthy family. So he had told them this story, and they seemed to think he was a perfectly nice guy. In his room, he stored supplies, chemicals, and equipment, and he used these to devise ways of attacking metal with acids in order to break into safes. His girlfriend was the beautiful 23-year-old Nina Vasilieva. Could have pronounced that wrong. Probably did. Who worked in a cigarette factory and was herself wanted in Russia for revolutionary activities. Now, there were so many people involved in this story that I've tried to keep it as clear as possible. Sorry if I haven't. Sorry if I've not succeeded in that. So one member of the gang is Max Smoller, also known as Joe Levi and Joseph the Jew. And he is, we're going to call him Smoller in this story, he was checking out places in the Houndsditch area that he said he wanted to use for storage. And this led him to the Exchange Buildings, which is a sort of small cul-de-sac backing onto the properties of Houndsditch, and he would rent number 11. So you've got the main thoroughfare of Houndsditch, which has jewellers, fancy goods stores, and all of that. And then behind them is this little cul-de-sac with tenement buildings. Smoller, Vasilieva, and another member, watchmaker and burglar, Joseph Sokolov, moved in to number 11. A week later, Svars would rent number 9 for a month. They had wanted to rent number 10, but number 10 wasn't available, but it became unoccupied on the 12th of December. So they couldn't rent number 10, but it was empty, and they made do with renting either side. Now, number 10 turned out to be directly behind their target, which was 119 Houndsditch, a jeweller's shop owned by Henry Samuel Harris. The safe in the jewellers was reputed to contain between £20,000 and £30,000 worth of jewellery, mostly diamonds, though Harris's son later said the total was only around £7,000. But it was apparently easy to find out that there was expensive things in the safe, and Gardstein's gang had set their eye on this. So they rent number 9 and number 11. Over the next 2 weeks, the gang bought in the necessary equipment for getting through to the jewellers and breaking the safe. On the 30th of November 1910, a 22-year-old clerk, George Richardson, is working late, and he's approached by 2 men and a woman who ask him about local jewellers' shops. He would later go on to be able to identify Gardstein, his girlfriend, and Sokolov, they think, could be Svars. They were not sure about the third man. On the night of Friday the 16th of December, Max Whale, who lived and worked as a fancy goods importer, possibly a dream job? Sounds nice, doesn't it? Fancy goods. Anyway, he's in number 120, to the right of 119, and he lives there. He returned home at about 10 o'clock that night to find his sister and maidservant, who lived with him, absolutely terrified. And they tell Whale that for the last 45 minutes, they had heard the sounds of drilling and sawing and breaking away at brickwork. So Whale goes to find out where this noise could be coming from. He goes next door and looks through the front window of Harris's shop, but he can't see anything suspicious. But he has heard the noises himself, and he is convinced that someone is trying to break in from the rear of the property. So he goes out onto the street to find a nearby policeman, who is Walter Piper, a young constable. I think he's on probation. Piper goes into Wales' house. He listens to the noises and decides to go round and investigate. So remember, this is on Houndsditch. He is going to go round to the back, to the cul-de-sac that's the exchange buildings. So he goes round, he speaks to some of the tenants who have been in the exchange buildings for some time and learns that the people living at number 11 have only been there for 3 weeks and are foreigners, never say, who are considered to have been behaving strangely. At 11 o'clock, Piper knocks on the door of 11 exchange buildings. The property has a light on at the back. The door's opened by a man. Piper asks if the missus is at home. The man says no, she's gone out, in what Piper would later describe as a Russian accent, and Piper returns to Houndsditch to get back up. He meets with Constables Ernest Woodhams and Walter Choate, who stand watch over the building while Piper goes back to Bishopsgate Police Station to notify Sergeant Robert Bentley and Constable Smoothie of the situation. So Piper, Smoothie and Bentley return to the scene and are joined by plainclothes police constables Martin and Strongman and 2 more sergeants, Charles Tucker and Thomas Bryant. It's now 11:30 at night and there are 7 uniformed and 2 plainclothes police officers outside a premises. They're all armed with their wooden truncheons. So Sergeants Robert Bentley and Thomas Bryant decide they're going to go and knock on the door of number 11, and it is opened by George Gardstein. And Bentley asks if anyone is doing any kind of work inside the house, and Gardstein doesn't answer. So Bentley, assuming that maybe Gardstein just hasn't really understood him, asks him to fetch someone who speaks English, and Gardstein goes back inside, leaving the door half open, and Bentley steps into the hallway. Now, Bryant, who's behind Bentley, can see the legs and lower half of a man standing on the stairs. And Bentley starts to speak to him, asking if the police can come in and have a look around. And the police step towards the closed door of what is assumed to be the parlour. At that moment, the door flies open and a man who would later be identified as Gardstein runs into the hallway, firing a gun. Bentley is hit in the right shoulder and the neck, severing his spine. Bryant was shot in the arm and chest, but managed to get to his feet and was later found leaning against the wall of number 10. Hearing the shots, Woodhams goes to try and help Bentley and is shot through the thigh and collapses with his femur broken. Strongman and Tucker, despite the desperate situation and only being armed with their wooden truncheons, approach number 11, where they see a hand come out from the doorway and start firing. The gunman then runs from the building, still firing, hitting Tucker once in the hip and once in the heart, and he is dragged away by Strongman. Gardstein is now out on the street with his pistol, whilst Sfars and Smoller rush from number 9 to help him. Constable Choate tries to get the gun from one of the men and is shot several times, collapsing on the street. Smoller is shooting wildly and accidentally hits Gardstein in the back, who's then carried away by Smoller, Sfars and Vasileva. With this, the shooting stops and what is left is a horrible scene. Constable Walter Choate has been hit 8 times, 5 in the legs and 3 in the body. He and Constable Ernest Woodhams, who has been hit in the thigh, were taken to the London hospital. 34-year-old Walter Choate died in hospital the following morning, and though Sergeant Bryant was able to walk himself to a local doctor, with a wounded arm, it was then discovered that he'd also got a chest wound, so he too was taken to the hospital. 47-year-old Sergeant Charles Tucker, who was married with 2 teenage children, died from his wounds on the way to the hospital. He had been due to retire weeks before, but had been persuaded to stay on for another year as the police needed maximum manpower for the coronation of King George V in June 1911. 37-year-old Sergeant Robert Bentley died on Saturday evening. His wife was days away from giving birth to their second child. He was half conscious on arrival at hospital, recovered enough to be able to have a conversation with his pregnant wife and answer questions about events, but then his health took a turn for the worse. The police searched the tenements rented by the gang, where they found oxygen cylinders, rubber tubing, tools, and debris from the privy wall in which a hole had been made, which was almost through to 119 Houndsditch. They also found that boards and ladders had been placed between the windows of 9 and 11, so the gang had passed between the 2 properties with no one noticing. Post-mortems on the dead policemen showed that they had been shot with automatic Mauser and Dreiss pistols. But it's not this incident which is most remembered, it's what would happen next. Wounded Gardstein was taken to 59 Grove Street, where Svars lived with his girlfriend, Luba Milstein, and painter Peter Piakow. Here he was laid on a bed, and Milstein and a neighbour, Sarah Trasjonski, did what they could to make him comfortable, but it soon became clear that he really needed professional help. So at 3:30 a.m, Dr. Joseph Scanlon was brought to the house, by which time Gardstein is in a hell of a lot of pain and he's vomiting blood. The doctor really sees what's happened. He gets told that he's been shot by a friend by accident, and he says this man has got to go to hospital, but all refused, including Gardstein. So the doctor says, well, I can give you pain relief, but there's nothing I can do. I pray it was morphine. Morphine's lovely, so fingers crossed. And the doctor says he's going to come back the next day. But before he goes back, Dr. Scanlon reads the morning papers, sees an account of the murders, and notifies the police that he's been asked to go and see a man with a gunshot wound to the back. And they say, you should go, tell us what you find. So he returns to Grove Street at about 11:15 that morning and finds Gardstein dead. He tells the police, who immediately go to the house with a team of 40 policemen and 2 inspectors from both City of London and Metropolitan Police Forces, all issued with weapons now. They find Gardstein dead in a bed soaked in blood, and Trasjonski, the neighbour, burning papers and photographs in the fire in a next-door room. Next to the bed, they find cartridges from a Mauser and a loaded Dreiss pistol, which could have been laid there by one of the other gang members wanting to basically say that Gardstein was responsible for all injuries and deaths. In Gardstein's pocket was the key to number 9, the Exchange Buildings, and so the search for the surviving members of the gang began, but it seemed that they had completely vanished. Gardstein's body was removed to the local mortuary, where his face was cleaned, his hair brushed, his eyes opened, and his photograph taken. And this picture and descriptions of those who'd helped him escape the Exchange Buildings were distributed on posters in English and Russian, asking locals for information. A local landlord, Isaac Gordon, reported one of his lodgers, Nina Vasilova, that after she told him she had been one of the people living at the Exchange Buildings, she was questioned by the police, and when her room was searched, they found anarchist publications and a photograph of Gardstein. A few gang members were rounded up under suspicion of being present at the time of the shooting, but they were dismissed due to lack of evidence. An inquest concluded that Bentley and Tucker had been killed by Gardstein, and whilst Choate had been shot by person or persons unknown. On the 22nd of December, a public memorial service took place for Tucker, Bentley and Choate at St Paul's Cathedral, with Home Secretary Winston Churchill and the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Strong, in attendance. Londoners were shocked by the murder of 3 unarmed policemen, and it was believed that up to 10,000 people were outside the cathedral. The local shops closed, and the London Stock Exchange ceased trading for half an hour to allow staff to watch the procession down Threadneedle Street. After the service, when the coffins were being transported on the 8-mile journey to the cemeteries, it was estimated that 750,000 people lined the route, many throwing flowers onto the hearses as they passed. Finally, on New Year's Day, 1911, the posters of Gardstein paid off, and police received information that Svars and Sokolov were hiding at lodgings at 100 Sidney Street in Stepney. Detectives were sent to watch the building to make sure the men didn't leave, and in the early hours of the 3rd of January, police quietly evacuated the other occupants of the building and blockaded the area. Then they threw pebbles at the window to attract the men's attention, with the hope that they would surrender once they knew that they were surrounded, but they were greeted with a shower of bullets. The police returned fire, though their guns were really only suitable for short-range firing, so they requested assistance and were joined by 21 marksmen from the Scots Guards, making the situation for the 2 fugitives in the building untenable. The standoff, which would become known as the Siege of Sidney Street, continued, drawing thousands of onlookers, including Winston Churchill. Eventually, after 6 hours, smoke was seen coming from the back of the building, and fire took hold of the upper rooms and flames poured from the roof. The fire brigade, anxious to stop the blaze, were told by Churchill to let the building burn, and only to prevent it from spreading to the next door buildings. At about 1:30 p.m, Sokolov put his head out of the window and was shot, falling backwards into the room, and firing completely ceased at 2 p.m, when the firemen were given the go-ahead to try and get the blaze under control. When they could eventually enter the building, it was falling down. They found the body of Sokolov quite quickly, but then a wall collapsed on a group of 5 firemen. The men were taken to the London hospital, but Superintendent Charles Pearson, who had a fractured spine, would later die of his injuries 6 months later. After shoring up the building, the firemen resumed their search, and at around 6:30 p.m, the body of Svars was found. Peter the Painter was by many considered to be the brains behind the robbery, and he made it across the Channel, where he disappeared. Smoller was never traced, though it's thought he escaped to France, and Gardstein's girlfriend, Nina Vasilova, would be found guilty of conspiracy to break and enter, though her sentence was quashed at an appeal in June 1911. Her fingerprints were all over the Exchange building, but these did not prove that she was involved, only that she was spending time with the man she loved. We couldn't tie her to any of the criminal activities. She remained in Brick Lane for the rest of her life and died there in 1963. Jacob Peters, Svars' cousin, returned to Russia, rose to be deputy head of the Cheka, the Soviet secret police, and was executed in Joseph Stalin's 1938 purge. Although they survived, neither Bryant nor Woodhams ever fully recovered from their injuries, and the siege of Sidney Street went down in London's history with the terrible incident that led to the death of 3 policemen just weeks before, often being overlooked. As a result of both incidents, the Metropolitan Police replaced the Webley revolver with the Webley and Scott 32 caliber MP semi-automatic pistol later that year, with the City of London Police following suit in 1912. In a weird but not unsurprising move, in September 2008, Tower Hamlets Council named 2 tower blocks in Sidney Street Peter House and Painter House. The name plaques on the building call Peter the Painter an anti-hero and the decision angered the Metropolitan Police Federation. A council spokesman said that there is no evidence that Peter the Painter killed the 3 policemen, so we knew we were not naming the block after a murderer, but he is the name the East Enders associate with the siege of Sidney Street. But not in a good way, surely. Like, I don't know, you wouldn't name a building Jack the Ripper building. You associate Whitechapel with Jack the Ripper, but let's not give him... It just seems such an odd move. And it's like, no, he probably didn't kill people then, but his gang were known for killing people. He was in a gang of people known for killing people. Seems very odd. So, yes, bizarre move by a London council. In the history of London, there are some fantastic people to name buildings after. How about the men who died doing their jobs, for example? In December 2010, 100 years after the events at Houndsditch, a memorial plaque for the 3 murdered policemen was unveiled. And 3 weeks later, on the anniversary of the siege, a plaque was unveiled in honour of Pearson, the fireman who had died because the building collapsed on him. And that is the story of the siege of Sidney Street. I really loved researching this episode, not because of the tragic events, obviously, but this sort of London history is my jam. So I hope you enjoyed it too. My sources for this episode include Greater London Murders by Linda Stratman, Wikipedia, obviously, and the British Newspaper Archive, and loads of internet research. I love to hear from you. Thank you to everyone who I've had some suggestions coming through on YouTube comments. Everyone on Patreon, if you suggest something, it gets done. That's a Patreon privilege. So if you're a member of the Patreon, A, you're bloody awesome. B, you're the best. And C, do feel free to suggest an episode because it will get done. And until next time, you can contact me by sending me an email, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can find us on social media at The Monday Night Review. And until next week, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.